Welcome to our conversation with David Giffels about his insightful new book, Barnstorming, Ohio. We're so glad that you're able to join us today. My name is Dr. Matt Akers, and I serve as Public Liaison for the Office of the President and as Associate Director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. The Bliss Institute is a bipartisan research and teaching institution dedicated to increasing understanding of the political process. And from the conversation with David today, I'm sure that we'll gain a better understanding of Ohio's unique role in our national politics, especially as we look towards the 2020 election. Before we begin our conversation with David, let me give a brief overview of our agenda. In a moment, I will introduce Dr. John Green, Emeritus of the Bliss Institute, and Professor Giffels. They will then have a 30-minute conversation about Barnstorming, Ohio, and then for the remainder of the time, we'll open it up to questions. Now, let me introduce Dr. Green and Professor Giffels. Dr. John Green is Director Emeritus of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics. His more than 30 years of service at the University of Akron includes time as Interim President of the University, Dean and Interim Dean of Buchtel College of Arts and Sciences, Vice Dean for Liberal Arts, Chair of the Department of Political Science, and Interim Chair for 5 other departments. He is also a Senior Research Fellow at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Health, and a political scholar whose insights are frequently reported by national newspaper and major broadcasters, as well as state and local news outlets. His published works include 9 books, 32 edited books, 39 referee journal articles, and 120 other scholarly and popular publications. He received his PhD from Cornell University and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Colorado. Now let me turn to Professor Giffels. David Giffels teaches creative nonfiction writing workshops and literature courses at the University of Akron. He also serves on the faculty of the Northeast Ohio Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing. Professor Giffels is the author of the memoir, Furnishing Eternity, A Father, a Son, a Coffin, and a Measure of Life, published in 2018, The Hard Way on Purpose, Essays and Dispatches from the Rust Belt, published in 2014, and the memoir All the Way Home, published in 2008. His books have won a number of awards. And I can tell you that I have read all of David's books, and I strongly recommend them. You can find them at your favorite bookshop, your online store, or you can order them directly from David's website, which is davidgiffels.com. He's also co-authored several books, and I think it shows the diversity of his writings too, of the rock biography, Are We Not Men? We Are Devo with Jade Dallinger, and also co-authored The Wheels of Fortune, The Story of Rubber in Akron with Steve Love. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Atlantic.com, Parade, The Wall Street Journal, Esquire.com, Grantland.com, Redbook, and many other publications. And I think probably my favorite item here on David's writing biography is he was also a writer for the MTV series Beavis and Butthead. So that is quite a diverse collection of writing there, David. And I will refrain from making any lead-in political joke there with your writing for that MTV series. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Green and Professor Giffels for some conversation before we open it up to questions from the audience. Dr. Green?
Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate that introduction. And David, thank you for being with us this afternoon to talk about your new book.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you, Matt, for that kind introduction.
You know, David, maybe a good place to begin is, could you tell us what the 2 or 3 main themes of Barnstorming, Ohio are?
Yeah, sure. So the premise of the book, the mission was to set off across Ohio the always reliable bellwether, not just during political seasons, but really kind of the nation at any time in our history, and to see what it was telling us in an especially charged time. I spent most of 2019 and early 2020 traveling, interviewing people, visiting places that I hoped would reflect the national story. And so the themes were, kind of like the things that are working on our minds as Americans right now. So themes of sort of a divided culture, not just politically, but by virtue of social media, lack of town squares. And I was trying to create sort of a town square vibe. Um, Themes that emerged as I was traveling were, this ongoing story of Ohio that has endured certain kinds of hard times that I think teach us lessons, can teach the nation lessons when other places haven't gone through those same hard times and might be entering them for the first time. But mostly the theme was, or the intent was, to allow people to speak for themselves, to listen to people on their own terms, and to a thing that so often happens during political times, which is try to extrapolate one person's experience or example into like a type or somebody that represents anything larger than themselves. I wanted people to be individuals in this book.
Well, thank you, David. I really enjoyed the book. And I'll tell you, the thing that I liked the most was the very thing you just referenced, that in your interviews, I really felt like I was talking to a whole bunch of real Ohioans, some of whom seemed very familiar, and some of whom were people I'd never met and honestly didn't even really know existed. So could you share with us a couple of your favorite interviews from the book?
Yeah, and then I want to hear who you were surprised by, because I find that interesting. You've talked to plenty of voters in your day. Really, the reward of this project was that everybody I talked to gave me something unexpected, and that's always the best thing that happens in journalism and in nonfiction writing. But I'd have to say one person that really stands out is somebody I knew before I went to visit Mansfield, and I knew the owner or the manager of the little bookstore in downtown Mansfield. And so I just wanted to drop in and sort of just listen to what was on her mind. And her name is Leyland Fowler, and we were talking. She moved from her hometown of Mansfield and has lived in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Boston, very attractive places for a young person. And yet as she was entering her 30s, she wanted to come back home. And she came back and she started managing this little bookstore that people said, this is not the easy way to make your living, an independent bookshop in downtown Mansfield. But she wanted to prove something and embrace something that she really believes, which is that there's a kind of America that people really want to believe still exists. A small town with a vibrant downtown, and not just a bookshop, but a record shop and a little independent coffee shop and so forth. And as she talked, she told me the story of how she leaves her apartment every morning in downtown Mansfield, and she walks to the bookstore, and she feels, as she said, like she's walking down Sesame Street. Like all the other shopkeepers are out there sweeping their doorsteps and waving hello to her from each side of the street. And she said, this is the America that we want to believe still exists. And then she went on to say how much sacrifice she has to make to continue that ideal, to live that way. She's not making any money. She left places, again, that are more glamorous and in some ways more vibrant. But she came here to feel like she was committed to something. I have been telling her story since this book came out as kind of like one of the standout examples. And here's where, the nonfiction writer has to remind himself or herself that the story doesn't end when the book ends. 3 weeks ago, I got an email from Leyland Fowler telling me that the bookstore is closing at the end of September. And so this story of how we endure and how we maintain an American ideal and how one has to make sacrifices also now has become a story of how precious and delicate those things are, how much we have to foster those things. She will probably go on to continue her idealism, but she won't be able to do it in the same way that her story is told in the book. So she's certainly one standout.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I got the sense from the way you've talked about that interview here and in previous comments you've made that in many ways this was a very rewarding conversation for you. But I want to ask you about maybe some of the other conversations you had that maybe were challenging, maybe not so rewarding, maybe conversations that made you feel uncomfortable. Could you give us an example of something like that?
Sure. The book is sort of a blend of journalism and political meandering and memoir. It also tells some of the stories of my own life over the course of the year. And on the very day the book opens, my son became a rookie Akron police officer. And so over the course of a year that included mass shooting in Ohio, a year that included a lot of racial strife, a year that really kind of tested the role of police, I kind of followed his story. And one of my visits was to Cincinnati, one of the most racially complex cities in the country. And I wanted to go to Cincinnati specifically to write about race in America. And one of the people I interviewed was the former mayor, Mark Mallory, who was the first elected black mayor in Cincinnati. And I asked him a question that I asked a lot of other people, which is a personal question, but also I think a political and cultural question, which is, what should my son, a young white police officer in an urban area, know? What should he understand that he might not understand? And Mark Mallory gave me some really great insight and some surprising insight into what it feels like to be a black citizen, what it feels like to be confronted by a police officer, that a young white sort of somewhat privileged person might not understand. And one of the small things he said that I think speaks a larger American story is he said, we think of police officers on horseback as kind of a heartwarming kind of thing you see at parades, kind of a public relations aspect of policing. And he said when African American citizens see an authority figure on horseback, they see an image of lynching. They see an image of a white slave owner coming to take back their property. Very different ways of seeing the same things. Kind of opened my mind. And then later in that same year, I was having dinner with a black friend from Detroit. I asked him the same question. I said, what should my son understand about you? And this is a younger black male who's been stopped by police, in ways that are common to the black experience. And he just said, without missing a beat, he said, assume I'm smarter than you. And what I really liked about his answer is, I think I understood immediately what he was saying, but the more I thought about it, the more it deepened, the more I had to think about it. And things that I was very aware of over the course of that year is how quickly any police officer has to think in any situation. And here's somebody giving me an answer that really required a lot of thought and continues to evolve in my own head. And that tension between having to act in the moment, but also having to sort of like think beyond what the moment gives us.
Well, you asked me what surprised me about your interviews. And, it's kind of interesting because Ohio, during all the time that I lived in Ohio, and probably all the time you lived in Ohio, has been going through a long-term transition. And that transition has with it high points and low points. And, one of the major changes over the last 50 years has been the decline of rural Ohio. And yet what I found really interesting, some of your interviews from people in rural Ohio, was this extraordinary sense of optimism that not only they personally, but their way of life really had a future, maybe a different kind of future than they envisioned. But that really surprised me, and that really took me aback, because I wasn't prepared to hear that kind of optimism from those kinds of people. So, I stand chastened and corrected, but it was really kind of interesting. But, let me just turn to the subtitle of your book, which I really like. which is, the title of the book is Barnstorming Ohio to Understand America. So given that you just told us that you don't want to submerge these individual stories in some kind of a larger set of hypotheses, how does your book help people, particularly at this really tough moment, have a better understanding of America?
Yeah. I will freely admit that the subtitle is, at the very least, optimistic to understand America, and maybe quixotic, in truth. But I have long believed that Ohio uniquely tells the national story, and some of that is, the work of the Bliss Institute. That has, sort of reflected and deepened this idea of the five Ohios, the fact that Ohio's regions break down uniquely to reflect the national sort of political template. But even more, in a more sort of spiritual and esoteric way, I feel like there's something about the Ohio's history and its sort of spirit of its people that sort of not, it isn't the only place that tells me the American story, but as I write in the book, it's no more American than any other place, but it is completely slow. So that there's something about being an Ohioan that you recognize yourself as sort of like, kind of like reflecting the true sort of spirit of, we were sort of like, early on, we were sort of like the frontier, the extent of the frontier. And then we became flyover country. Everything moved beyond us to the west, and so we knew what it was like to be a destination, and now what it's like to be a place that's often misunderstood or ignored, which is really most places in America. And the more I dug into that concept, the more evidence I found of the sort of unique Americanism of the Ohio experience. The fact that we're sort of the end of the East, we're sort of the beginning of the Midwest, we're sort of the end of the North, and sort of the beginning of the South. And so we have all of these different aspects of the American experience that we can reflect. And then to find people who can tell stories that are the national stories, but through the eyes of an Ohioan, I think was a way of sort of testing that. And over again, I felt like people were giving me that back.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I've written about my entire career is the diversity of Ohio. And I think that's one of the things that's underappreciated, even by people who are Buckeyes, just how diverse this state is. And one response in Ohio history to that diversity is the state has a bias towards moderation. I mean, how are you going to get Cincinnati and Cleveland on the same page? Well, one way is you seek common ground. And yet, in this election, in this period of our history, here in Ohio, but across the country, there seems to be less and less common ground. So what I wanted to ask you is there something in your interviews that was insightful about why Americans and Ohioans are so divided today?
I think social media is the obvious answer, and it's obvious for a reason, because I think it really has degraded civic discourse. It's interesting because this book ends at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think one thing the pandemic has revealed is that we've been even more stuck in our, in these cubes that we're all in, and even less sort of social and mixing with people of different ideas. And so it's a danger. It's something that wore me down over the year of really digging into this. And yet what I found is when I would reach out to people and go sit with them and again talk to them on their own terms, I found that feeling started to go away, that people became less of this sort of narrow-cast version of themselves or what one would think of that character, and a fully rounded human being. So the farmer I went to, for instance, to tell the story of the plight of the American farmer in 2019, 2020, in a year of the trade war with China, which was just killing, the Ohio soybean farmers, and historic rainfall. I knew that's the story I was there for, but as always happens when you listen to people, his story opened up much more broadly, and he became much more nuanced, and he told me things that surprised me. And this happened over and over again. And so it just proved a simple truth that if we listen to another person, and especially another person of a different point of view, and we do it face to face, where we can't hide behind, the troll stuff on social media, it reinforces an optimism, a hope that, again, that I was feeling somewhat nervous about.
Well, it is interesting because we live in this age where it has never been easier for ordinary people to get information. And, that's something that has some very positive attributes. But I think what you just pointed out is it has some really negative side as well. In the days when it was hard to learn things, and so you had to do it sort of person by person, step by step, encounter by encounter, we got to know each other with much more depth. And what we discovered, I think, was that despite numerous differences, we always had something in common that we could work together on. But in Ohio politics today, some of those long-standing relationships have been turned upside down. So, for instance, Ohio, the Mahoning Valley is the home of white working class people who historically would have been Democrats. But in the last few years, they've turned towards the Republican Party, and they have a special affinity for Donald Trump. Not just his issues, but his style, which is really pretty interesting. On the other hand, in the suburban areas around Akron and Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus, we have a group of well-off, well-educated, affluent people who historically would have been the backbone of the Republican Party, and yet they find themselves increasingly supportive of the Democratic Party, partly because, frankly, they don't like Donald Trump, and particularly his style. Did you see some examples of those inversions politically as you barnstormed the state?
Yeah, I spent more time in the Mahoning Valley, I think, than anywhere else, because just as I was beginning my work, the Lordstown GM plant was being shut down, and eventually closed permanently over the course of that year. And the Lordstown plant worker is the quintessence of that example of the worker, the union worker who voted twice for Barack Obama, whose picture is still hanging in the Union Hall from a visit that he made during his presidency, and turned in great numbers toward Trump. And so I got insight into why people made that decision, what they were attracted to. And as you said, in many cases, he was something, they liked that he was somebody different, that he was this outsider. And one of the people I interviewed for this, in fact, I think, one of the very few politicians, because I've said many times, this is a political book that's not about politics, but Tim Ryan must have known I was writing a book about Ohio in a political year, so he decided to run for president, which made him a perfect fit for this project. So I spent time with Tim Ryan, talking to him not only about his experience running for the Democratic nomination, but also as a really, true understander of that part of Ohio. And he gave me a lot of insight into the the things that we thought would seem to be offensive about Donald Trump, and why that didn't play to them. Because he said the Democrats were running all these ads saying, he says really offensive things, he uses bad language, and he's rude. And he said, you talk to a mill worker who is used to cursing as part of their daily life, and that just doesn't have that same ring in the ears as the people who made that ad might think. And he said, you talk to people in the Mahoning Valley who are Democrats about the Second Amendment, and many of them are recreational hunters. They see guns as being a very sort of wholesome American thing. And he said, there's a lot of disconnect between the party and between the kinds of people who his district embodies.
You know, David, in your book, you mentioned, I mean, one of the things, many things that you and I have in common is, you know, we come from families where there's a lot of political differences.
Yeah.
And, you know, you often hear stories that, you know, families, they dread Thanksgiving because, you know, Uncle Charlie's going to show up and Aunt Ellen, and those two have never gotten along and it's going to be unpleasant. You know, in my family, people look forward to Thanksgiving because they could have a very frank exchange of views where nobody could get up and leave, right? And so people would hear each other out. But did you learn anything from writing this book about how to talk to your relatives that have different views than yours?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I wrote about one of my brothers. I admit, don't admit, I'm very clear early in the book about that I did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016, and in fact, I took one of those online tests to see where you are on the political spectrum, which is not a scientific test, but you know, like sort of confirmed my sense of myself as a moderate. Um, but I wrote about the conversations I was having with my brother right after the 2016 election, who voted for Trump, and the fact that we could talk with an understanding of our difference, and even at that, it could be uncomfortable, but because we and you know a full lifetime of pre-existing understanding about each other, that we could have this conversation in a pretty healthy way. But you get past those comfort zones and it's very difficult. One thing I found over the course of the year, something I already think I knew but really was reinforced, was how uncomfortable people are being specific about their politics, especially with a stranger. Now, because I approached people and was very clear that I wanted to hear them, you know, again on their own terms, I think I was able to get past that. But in common life, I don't think that's happening much at all, and I think it's very unhealthy. One of the things I wrote about is while I was doing this work, the New York Times published a big piece on a social science experiment that was conducted last year, where these two social scientists brought together, I think it was 80 people, that they had used some algorithm to identify them as representative of the entire political spectrum. And they brought them together for a weekend retreat. And they just put them together in random groups. They gave them current events topics to talk about, and they let them go. And what they found at the end of that weekend was that, first of all, that people had felt very engaged with people from very different points of view, and that most of the people who took part left this experience not feeling like their mind had been changed, but feeling like they understood each other better. And that, I have been trying to think of ways to recreate that experience, because I think, you know, I think one of my strong takeaways from this project is that ultimately we're more alike than different. But it doesn't feel like that when I get away from the experience of talking to people the way I was talking to them. And so if we can put more of us in more situations where there's a healthy dialogue, where there's sort of like, this is how we're going to talk, and it's okay to think differently than I do, I think it would be helpful to the culture that we're in right now.
You know, when I was growing up, even though I came from a very political family, my mother used, and by political I mean people who were very interested and engaged in politics. And I remember my mother telling me, though, now you got to be very careful, because outside of, you know, our circle, you really shouldn't talk to people about their politics or their religion. And as I'm sure you know, I spent my entire career talking about both at the same time. But and I came to learn that there were certain skills that one had to develop to be able to talk about these things in a cogent way. Could you give us a little bit of advice of what those skills might be from your experience?
Yeah, and you know, I was a working newspaper journalist for 18 years, so I'm used to talking to people, and you know, I mean, the skills are pretty easy. It's just to train yourself to be a listener. You know, the trick of interviewing isn't asking questions; it's knowing how to listen, and you know how to let somebody talk. And the longer you let somebody talk, the more themselves they will become. one of the things I found pretty consistently is that most people right now are talking sort of in code about their politics. Like often somebody won't say who they voted for. They'll sort of hint at where they are. It's there's not a lot of sort of direct conversation. And I think one thing that I found again was just nodding and listening empathetically is that when somebody started to feel comfortable, sort of talking more directly about their political lives to somebody who didn't seem to be ready to confront them or sort of refute what they were saying, um, that the conversation evolved really naturally and healthily from there. Um, so I don't think we are a culture of good listeners in the time that we're living in right now. And again, I think that's because we're very recently we've become a culture that has found ways, as you said, there's more information than ever, but we've also found ways to gate our information so that we're not really listening. We're just filling ourselves up with information that aligns with what we already think and believe, and that's not listening. That's just sort of like reinforcing and narrowing a point of view.
Well, thank you, David. Let's bring some other people into the conversation.
Sure.
Matt, do you have some questions for our guest?
We do. Several of them touch on some of the topics that we've been discussing. So one of them is from Rick asked, do you think the people you interviewed are typical or atypical of their neighbors? So in other words, do you think that if we're reading your book to understand Ohio and the rest of the nation, do you think that your book has a good cross section of people that you were able to interview?
Yeah, I sort of have to answer that carefully because again, I wanted people to be individuals. I didn't want I resisted trying to extrapolate their experience to a larger experience. But that said, what I found, and I spent a good deal of time in most of the places I went. So it wasn't like I just talked to one person and that represented a whole town or a whole region. Um, and I would say that, and as somebody who has written and thought a lot about the notion of localism and regionalism, that the people I talked to did reflect their neighbors, that we are still sort of products and reflectors of our places, whatever those are. So for me, Akron, Northeast Ohio, I know that there are common experiences here that one person's version of that experience does kind of reflect a sort of subculture of that place. In the same way that the Ohio Valley, the people I talked to in the Ohio Valley did seem to sort of carry a certain set of traits that I think were reflective of that culture and experience. And in southwestern Ohio, again, similar experience there. So yeah, I do think that that's the case, but I'm sure I could find a neighbor that sort of breaks that trend very easily in any case.
Well, and to follow up on that, David, one of the other questions was out of all of the places you have visited in Ohio, what was the place that stood out to you as the most politically diverse?
Politically diverse. That's a good question.
I was starting to think about that in terms of the five Ohios and just, wondering if we limit it, and not limit it, but if we use that as the kind of paradigm, is there an area of those five Ohios, whether it's the Northeast or the Northwest or
Yeah.
Southeast, Southwest, or center of Ohio, that any of those struck you as being more widely divergent than other areas?
It's kind of funny because it seems to me that the larger metropolitan areas do tend to be more politically diverse, but by that I mean that there are uh, a lot of Democrats in the cities and a lot of Republicans in the suburbs. So if you say Northeast Ohio is politically diverse, it's not that that everyone is mixed up together. It's that there's some of everything within like a region. I'd be curious to hear John's answer to this because he probably can. I'm sort of like on the ground in the weeds, and I think John probably has a little bit broader view of that pattern.
My experience has been that one of the most genuinely diverse parts of Ohio is a part that a lot of people don't think about, which is northwestern Ohio, the area around Toledo and out in places like Bowling Green. In fact, one of the most interesting experiences I ever had in Ohio was talking politics at a bar with people in Lima, Ohio. And it just amazed me because these were people that lived next door to each other and had very, or not very far at least from each other, who had very diverse points of view, and nonetheless seemed to enjoy talking to each other about how different they were. And that's really kind of interesting. But I know exactly what you're talking about. There's what you might call integrated diversity, where you have people of different walks of life and different points of view and different backgrounds who are in each other's space, so to speak. And then you have parallel diversity, where this neighborhood is one way and that neighborhood is the other way. They don't mix a lot, but when they vote for president or they vote for mayor, they contribute to a more diverse politics. I think the integrated diversity, if I can coin that phrase, is the most exciting to me, but it's also the one that's most filled with peril, because there's a lot of vulnerability there, and there takes a certain level of trust to navigate that kind of world. If you think about the Republican suburbs and the Democratic city, whatever milieu you come from, you can always easily retreat to home and be around kindred spirits. So it's a kind of interesting way to think about diversity.
Well, it's interesting that you point that out, because I'm thinking back in 2004 during the run up to the presidential election. I did a similar project as a columnist for the Akron Beacon Journal. I traveled around Ohio doing similar work on a smaller scale. But the place that always stayed with me was I went to the town of Hicksville, partly just for the cheap joke of going to Hicksville, and I went there, and actually what had happened is we had been traveling. I was with a photographer longer than we thought we would be, and we were starving. And so we found the local diner and we went in to eat. And we weren't there to report, but while we were there, it was like the sort of like the classic, like sort of like political reporter in the small town diner. I overhear the conversation at the next table, and it's like half a dozen retirees in the afternoon having their coffee, and they're talking about politics. So of course I walked up to their table and asked if I could, hear the story. And it was that experience. There was one guy who was a Democrat and 5 Republicans, and they were just razzing each other. It was like there was no animosity. It was just, they were having fun. But I think this is part of the Ohio experience. Is Ohio, by virtue of its relatively slow or almost static population growth, by virtue of the fact that not a lot of new people come here, that especially at the small town level, what you have is a lot of people who are very familiar with each other. And so I think that familiarity allows them to have a political conversation that is less confrontational and divisive, because they still understand each other on a scale that gets harder to do, I think, the bigger the place or the more diverse the culture. So the small town where every family knows each other, I think it's easier to, it's closer to a family dynamic.
Yeah, this brings up another question that we have here, David, that I think ties in with this. This question is from Leah. One of the most striking political divides, and you can see it on national county voting result maps, is the urban-rural divide. I've lived in Morgan County with one of the smallest populations in Ohio, and now I live in Akron, and I'm perplexed by this urban-rural fault line. How did this divide reveal itself to you in your travels and interviews?
So I went to Martins Ferry, Ohio, which is in the Ohio Valley, and I had gone there just before the 2016 election to write about it, but I wanted to go back. And when I went there in 2016, what I found, it was the first time I traveled from my home in Akron to that part of Ohio. And I found as I went through Akron and then south through Canton that I saw fewer Clinton campaign signs than I guess I thought I had been seeing. And it was about this time in the election season. And as soon as I passed that, sort of invisible divide, but anyone who's traveled that 77 South route knows you can almost feel the terrain change. And you feel like you pass out of that country and all of a sudden the Trump signs, they're much bigger, like the billboard size, and much more of them. And so I experienced that. I'm sure if I made that drive now, I would see the same phenomenon take place. But you can almost feel like when you pass through these uh, these boundaries, these political boundaries, just on the roadway by that kind of thing seeping in. So I can't. I mean, I can't say why that's true, but I can say that it is true. And I think anyone who's traveled around the state during, especially presidential election political season, feels that same thing.
We've been talking a lot about place here, and one of the things that I always find interesting when I read a book, and one of the reasons that I loved Barnstorming Ohio so much was that I could read about places that I know very well in there. And glancing at the people we have on the line here, I think many of us either have been in the Akron area for a long time, or some of us were born here and have lived here our entire lives, and very familiar with Rolling Acres Mall, and the transition of Rolling Acres Mall into the Amazon Fulfillment Center. And I was just wondering if you might comment a little bit on that chapter in your book, why you included that, and perhaps what that transition or transformation from the shopping center into an Amazon fulfillment center might tell us about our area and about our economy.
Yeah. Boy, it's hard to comment a little on the topic of Rolling Acres. I wanted to write about it in part because my experience as a newspaper columnist, as I write in the book, taught me that Rolling Acres was the one reliable gift that keeps on giving as far as information, not just information about, first of all, it's like this shared experience, the shopping mall of the second half of the 20th century is a place that it's weird how that became the thing that's the cultural sort of galvanizing point, but it is, because so many people went there just to do common things, but they also had very personal experiences there. They would meet, boyfriend or girlfriend there, or they would, hang out with their friends, and so they were like the town centers, and so they have a meaning beyond just their buildings and beyond just the commerce that took place there. So then as it goes into decline, it becomes this, it's like our Acropolis. It's this very public symbol of something that has failed. And so in Akron, Rolling Acres was, code for something much larger than a shopping mall. And so then the irony of a force that many people sort of see as helping to have pushed shopping malls out of business, Amazon.com and online commerce, suddenly like comes in and starts not just Rolling Acre, but is taking over all of these dead malls across the Midwest and across the country, to use as distribution centers, because they happen, for the same reason the malls were built there. They're in near population centers, they're near major transportation routes, so they fit everything that Amazon would need, and they're available. They're empty, they're cheap, and so now there's this cultural tension of people seeing Amazon as being a negative force in some ways on the American way of life, but also in a place that needs jobs, which is very often where these malls are. They're suddenly providing this new source of jobs. I know many people who have applied for the jobs that are just about to begin at Rolling Acres, and are very thankful for the the full-time job with a decent hourly wage and health benefits and all of that. So it's a really complex topic that was super interesting to write about. That is kind of evolving in our midst, even over the course of the year that I was writing this.
Yeah, and like you say, I think you pretty much addressed this already, but obviously that has local ramifications here in the Akron area, but it's also something occurring nationwide, across America. What are your thoughts in terms of some of these economic issues that we've been talking about, in terms of, how does that play into the future of the American economy? I mean, will it still center on more, whether shopping malls or Amazon fulfillment centers, or as you discuss in the book, obviously, whether it's Youngstown with steel or Akron with rubber, that idea of manufacturing a product? Do you think there's going to be a future there, or is it more on the malls transformed into Amazon fulfillment centers?
That's the future of the American economy. I don't think I could speak that broadly, but what I can say is that there was a message that started to come through from the people I was talking to as a consistent theme, that something that I wasn't expecting, and that the theme essentially was how mindful we need to be of the small decisions and the big decisions that we make in our common lives, that may help determine the future, not only of the American economy, but what it means to be an American. And I'll tell you two examples, and why this came as a surprise. So I spent time with a farmer in central Ohio in Delaware County. And one of the things, one of the questions I kind of asked in different ways, but I would always say, what should people understand about you, and what should any political candidate understand about you? And what this farmer said is that they should understand that it's become so easy to be an American consumer that we no longer have to think about where our food comes from. And as he said, many of us think our food was manufactured in the back room of the grocery store. And he said it's very important to be mindful, to know if you're supporting an American farmer or not, and to know what the support of the American farmer means, not only to Ohio, but and not only to a whole way of life, but in a sense, to America itself. And so, this small decision of knowing where your milk came from, or whatever it is that might not make much of a difference, creates that mindfulness. I had a completely different conversation with the president of the union at Lordstown, and he said, it doesn't matter, buy American doesn't mean buy a General Motors car or buy a Ford car. He said, know and find out where your car was assembled, because that's the important part of that chain, is where that job is. Because the difference between that assembly place is the difference between an American putting food on their table or not. Two very different kinds of people, if you look at them in terms of their political expectations. One's a strong Republican Trump voter, one's not. And yet their message was exactly the same. Leyland Fowler, the bookstore owner that I told you about earlier, had the same message. If you don't support the local independent bookseller because it's easier to shop at Amazon, and that bookseller goes out of business, it means that something you still want to believe about American small towns can't be true anymore. And look what just happened to her. She's just gone out of business. And yet the complication of that is that now we say, okay, well, Amazon killed Main Street Books in Mansfield, Ohio, speaking like sort of loosely. And yet Amazon is providing jobs for people in that same region who are in some ways desperate for jobs. So there's this complexity to how we make those decisions. But again, it's this idea of of not, it's so easy to live as an American, to do everything online and to not have to think about it, that they're warning us not to stop thinking that way.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll turn back here. We've got a number of questions on more going back to politics, so we'll leave place for a moment. And this is a question, and he says, there's so much focus on the 2020 election right now. I was wondering if you got a sense from people about what they thought comes after it is over, regardless of who wins, in terms of what happens to us because of all of our the division that we've been talking about here, right? Culturally, politically, in every way. So, do you get any sense of what people, are they hoping that there'll be a resolution after the election's over?
I think people are exhausted. I mean, that is one thing that I got not only from this experience, but just in living my life. I think we're exhausted by division and by just the drama of, 2020, my God. And, we were joking this morning, we had a run through of this and we're like, well, we should have plenty to talk about, but who knows how much will happen over the course of the next 7 hours before we actually go live. And I think it is really wearing people down. So I can't, I mean, I can't not believe that on November 4th, there isn't going to be, or whenever we find out who won, that divide isn't going to be ugly. I think it is going to be ugly. I hope whatever comes out of this, that there is an instinct from the top toward civility and toward healing and toward empathy. Cory Booker introduced the notion of what he termed a crisis of empathy when he was a candidate. And that phrase really struck me. That phrase has stayed with me in so many different renditions since then, because, again, I said before that really, it's just a matter of listening. We have to retrain ourselves to listen and to think about how the other side of something feels. And we shouldn't have to have a crisis happen to us to understand somebody who's been through that crisis. With COVID, not to call out the president, but yesterday he said now he understands because he's had it, what this means. And that troubles me because, we need to understand experiences that we haven't had. And I'm hoping that there can be some ways, and, the Bliss Institute has the ability to do some of this because you're so good at fostering public discourse, is to find ways to maybe recreate that experiment that the New York Times reported on, where people from different points of view are able to talk safely, in safe spaces, to regenerate, a sense of community and diversity in community and respect for other points of view.
Yeah, I think we would definitely be interested in talking with you more about that offline, because I think that you're right. It sounds maybe somewhat simple, but I think simply having people together engaged in conversation about controversial topics and without it resulting in yelling and open disagreement, that's something remarkable today. So I think that's something definitely, especially through the Greater Akron Civility Center, which is housed within the Bliss Institute, we definitely be interested in talking about that. I did want to get one question here. We have a number of Mandel scholars from Cuyahoga County Community College, and that's a great program, so we're glad they joined us. And there are a number of questions here from them. We won't get to all of them, but one of them that I think would be, especially for you, David, as you mentioned, being a journalist for a number of years with the Akron Beacon Journal. Based on your travels and conversations, do you think the media covers politics fairly? And as a second part to that, how does the media shape our political perceptions?
The term the media has become, I think, more diverse and yet used more like as a blanket term. So what I mean by that is there's a big difference between the personality-driven evening network shows that are intended to have a point of view and responsible reporting. And so the problem is that somebody who associates just choosing a name, Sean Hannity, with the work of a daily journalist at the Akron Beacon Journal is not making a fair connection, because those are different things. But the problem is that the figures that have those points of view have sucked so much air out of the room that it's hard to understand that good journalism is still being done at every level, all the way up to, when I watch CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, I, as a longtime professional in that business, I can understand the difference between the work that the reporters are doing and the work that the ideological personalities are doing. But I don't expect most people who haven't had that experience to understand that difference. And so, sorry if I lost the thread of the question, but I think it was whether responsible media is still being done. Absolutely, it is. And I would say trust and support your local news sources first. This kind of goes back to that other sort of like big picture notion of be mindful of where you get your information from. And in general, I think you can trust your local news sources best. And this also goes to that small town function, because they're closer to you. They understand you, and they have reasons to be objective that the opinion driven media does not. So, but know where the sausage is made. Yeah, it's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, thank you, David. That's it's just disappointing that we have such a problem today with local media being able to survive. That's I agree with you completely. I know that's an issue. So. Well, I am very sorry to say that we're almost at the hour here. So I think we did have plenty to talk about, even if there weren't a whole lot of new developments today since this morning. But I do want to thank both Dr. Green and Professor Giffels for being with us today. Was there anything either one of you wanted to add before we say goodbye here?
Well, only one thing from me. Please read David Giffels' book. You will find it very rewarding. And by the way, David, you don't have to put the check in the mail. I already got it by reading the book. It was well worth it. So congratulations on a great book.
Well, and please read Mr. Chairman, Dr. Green's excellent book, and all of his other books. But you will need to set aside a lot of time, because there are so many of them. But just want to thank the Bliss Institute and you, Matt, and Dr. Green especially for putting so much work and thought into this. It was a great experience for me in too quick of an hour.
Well, and again, thanks to all of our audience who joined us. We will be putting this on the website and on social media. Please feel free to, if you did not get your question answered, we do have some still here in the chat function. If you would like to have a question, and I think I'm speaking for David here, if you just send your email to Kim Haverkamp, that's kh1@uakron.edu, we will get that question over to David, and I think he'd be happy to answer it offline. So one thing I did want to mention, everybody, I know we're right at time here, but for those of you who are interested in kind of Northeast Ohio politics, the Greater Akron Chamber is hosting a virtual candidate forum, and it is again hosted by the Greater Akron Chamber, sponsored by both federal and state communications, as well as the Bliss Institute, and Bliss Institute staff will be doing the moderating of both of these conversations with the candidates. The first one is going to be on October 13th at 3:30, and that is the again Northeast Ohio Democratic candidates, both federal and state level. Then we will do the Republican candidates on October 27th at 3:30 p.m. Again, that registration information can all be found on the Greater Akron Chamber's website. And again, that will be a time to interact with the candidates, Usually it's in person. Of course, this year it's going virtual, but we do hope that you'll join us. Again, any questions on that, please go to the Greater Akron Chamber website, or you can always, again, email Kim Haverkamp for more information. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Thanks again. We really appreciate it. And make sure that you go out and vote in the upcoming election. All right. Thanks again. Take care.